mining tin in Ampang at the time. So we've seen this country change, and we've seen it change in ways that nobody anticipated it would. But I think this brings with it certain costs, political costs and social costs as well. And I'm ambivalent as to what these costs are. In one sense, it cannot be denied that Malaysia, like many of the other countries of Southeast Asia, have really prospered in a material sense. In a material sense. This is undeniable in terms of quality of life. Basic things which today you take for granted were not around even during my childhood. Air conditioning, for example, which was never there. This was, the first time we saw color TV. I mean, today you're born in it. When we saw color TV, it was like seeing a UFO. We've never seen anything in color then. So that's the speed. The hyperbolic developmental curve that we've seen across Southeast Asia is unprecedented. Some of these changes are, I think, important, and they are for the good. The most significant being, as you can see yourselves among you today here, the most important step being the mass education of women in Southeast Asia. The rise of literacy and higher education for women. I also lecture in universities in Indonesia, and in Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia, one thing we have in common along with many ASEAN countries is in almost all major universities, women are a majority. And this, I think, is a significant development for us, because the generation before were the generation whose education, like my mother's education, had to stop by 16. So when we talk about the loss of certain social norms and all that, I'm ambivalent, because I think some social norms should go. Certain social norms, like certain social norms which dictated that in the past, women by the age of 12, 13, 14, 15 should be married off and stop their education, I believe ought to have gone, and I'm happy they're gone. I'm happy these things are gone, and I'm happy to see that in many of the universities, most of our universities, we have such a high number of female students. However, the other things that we've seen also is the expansion of the public domain in Southeast Asia, Malaysia being no exception. The emergence of a vernacular press, the emergence of a lower middle class intellectual elite, a writing space which historically never existed in the past. Professor Khoo talked about the age of the kingdoms. One thing we forget is that during the age of the kingdoms, the subjects of the kingdoms found less freedom to write than those in many of the colonial settlements. That's why many of the pioneering kaum muda intellectuals were actually based in Singapore, Malacca, and Penang, because that's where the productive activities took place. So some of these social norms, I believe, do deserve to be challenged. But Malaysia today is caught in a position which is, I think, unprecedented in its history, certainly not anticipated by the first and second generation of technocrats and nation builders. We now see, when we look at the demographic chart of Malaysia, the pyramid. Clearly, in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, India, young populations, restless populations who are demanding a place in the economic political framework of the countries. And yet, the dilemma faced by so many of these governments today is how to deliver reforms at a pace that can be accepted by a majority of the public without the disruptive effects of social transformations on a scale that cannot possibly be taken into account. It's one thing to increase the level of literacy for the first generation of first Malayans in the 50s and 60s. 10, 20 years later, that rising level of literacy translates into a growing number of students demanding places in universities. 10 years after that, that growing number of students who have graduated from universities translates into a growing number of young graduates seeking employment. The model of development in many parts of Southeast Asia, like the many other countries in the developing world, has always been that states seek to, on the one hand, develop their societies and economies, but on the other hand, manage the demands that are generated as a result of successful development. The problems that countries like Malaysia faces, like Indonesia faces, like India faces, these are not problems of failed states. Ironically, these are problems of successful states. It's when you've delivered education, when you've created graduates, that you are faced with this problem of graduate unemployment. Failed states don't have this problem. If you have no working educational system, you will not be faced with problems like this. So our problems are, ironically, the result of our success. But I think in Malaysia and in many countries of Southeast Asia and many countries of Asia in general, what we are seeing now is this generational gap. The generational gap between the first generation of nation builders, technocrats, state builders, who projected into a future, believing that through simply drawing a map and a diagram of what sort of nation they wanted to build, this nation could be created without problems. One thing that has been factored out or not taken into account, of course, are all the variables that might interrupt this process. Variables that would enter the process and complicate the nation building process even further. Go back and read the newspapers. It's not very difficult. You can go to any of the major newspapers in this country, go through their archives. Go back and read all the newspapers in Malaysia from the 60s and 70s, and you'll note, for example, an absence of one thing which today permeates Malaysian political discourse, and that is religion. 40s and 50s, these were not seen as such important issues, and they were not divisive markers. And it's startling when you read the editorials of the English press and the vernacular press in Malaysia up to the mid-60s, how inter-religious contact seemed much easier then than it has become now. And I think the rise of all these distinctions, religion, ethnicity, language, race, these have come to the fore once again, in a sense because, as Professor Khoo noted, they've been deeply rooted already in the framework of the colonial nation state prior to the creation of Malaya proper. But not only have they been rooted there as permanent fixtures on our political landscape, they have been reactivated. They have been reactivated from the 70s onwards, simply because of the nature of the contestation and competition for resources that we see in Malaysia today. Your generation will go through things that my generation never had to go through. And what strikes me when teaching students half my age, in their late teens and early 20s, is how there seems to be a gap in not only obviously age and experience, but interestingly a gap in terms of the subjective way in which people view themselves and their place in society. I make this point again and again, and let me make it here. When I talk to older generations, the first generations of Malayans, like the first generation of Indonesians and the first generation of Singaporeans, what I notice in them, despite the fact that they are physically older, is that in terms of the way they view the world, in a sense, they are much younger. They are younger because they were the children of the 40s and the 50s who came into political maturity in the 40s and the 50s, at a time when they believed in the Malaya project and the Malaysia project that came after. They believed that through simple technocratic planning, nation building could be done. You could build nations. You could struggle against colonialism, win your independence, manage the economy, and build a state.